andate a loro, dagli organizzatori, ex organizzatori.
Vediamo abbiamo detto che l'hai fatto una lunga.
Vabbè, a parte dicono che dovevo digerire su poi, quindi
Cioè, dovrò far pensare.
ci dovrebbe essere un altro. Le parti mie sono di cui ho cercato di poi ci sono delle parti intermedie che servono a consentire al lettore a capire se la foglia ho fatto fatica. Ho letto una prima volta, non ho capito che ho letto una seconda volta, mi parto molto più lui non definisce le parole chiare che consentono di capire come questo
ma io infatti l'ho capito molto meglio a lezione una volta che ho capito la cosa si è come aperta, adesso quando lo leggo riesco a capire, però è quasi all'inizio sì,
vai prima dopo.
sono aperta a qualsiasi soluzione. Vada che non si connetta, l'altro è caduto, si è assegnato. No, cioè, testa qualcosa e sta asciugando le madonna. Ho spaccato la testa e ora torna.
No, speriamo sia
Ma quello che chiamiamo da quando posso chiamare. Mi mandava la male, capito
Direi che possiamo iniziare, no? Tanto poi lui si collegherà tra pochi minuti, così iniziamo con la presentazione.
Diciamo a Roberto per favore, magari dobbiamo. Ah no, si connette a un quarto, lui aveva detto fatti
tra 4 minuti si connette.
Sì, esatto.
Però lui non vuole parlare subito, forse. Sì. E quindi magari facciamo noi un attimo una presentazione. Facciamo noi la presentazione al volo e poi...
Però poi c'è un'interruzione se non si collega, giusto? Segnala questo.
Lui sentirà all'inizio della presentazione, poi parte lui. Vabbè. Allora iniziamo.
Approfittando che non c'è Jameson, parliamo in italiano, poi quando si connetterà passiamo all'inglese. Allora, giusto 2 parole per presentare il presentatore e per ringraziarvi di essere di oggi, di aver accettato il nostro invito as speakers.
Right there. Okay. No, vieni qua, che così ti vede.
Sì, adesso c'è.
So, camera is rolling, everything is going on. It's Jameson time. So, just a few words to present the presenter, to thank you for being here, or accepting our invitation, our speakers, chairs, guests. And we are grateful to Iuno to be our host today and to host I don't know if this is the first conference entirely dedicated to Jameson, but it's definitely the first conference after Fredric Jameson turned 90 that is entirely dedicated to Fredric Jameson. His work, its contribution to literary criticism and the reading of literary and cultural texts. So it's not a secret that Jameson turned 90. but we just discovered that Jameson doesn't like presents. He makes presents himself and gives them to us, because actually this month a book is out which is called Invention of the Present, Novel of and the Crisis of Globalization. There is another book that is coming out and is scheduled for October, The Years of Theory. And there is a third one announced, Mimesis, Expression, and Construction. So those are the gifts, the presents that Fredric Jameson gave to us. Well, this conference, in a way, well, I cannot say that benefits, but there is this coincidence of a birthday and the conference and this gathering that make me think of Günter Grass' novel, The Meeting in Pepe, that starts with a gathering for a birthday. In that case, where the birth was the birthday of Richter, the founder of the Group 47, but because the book was dedicated to him. But in the story starts saying that what we are reading had happened already in the past. And this conference actually had two moments that contributed to the work of the conference. The first one is not very far away in time and happened at the Associazione Walter Benjamin, where Massimo Palma and Marco Gatto and I at the first moment in which we together start thinking about Jameson and his work from different perspectives and in different areas. But there is another event that happened very far away in time and less voluntary in a way. It was a very strange coincidence that Daniele's Balicco first book review to appear on Manifesto was my first translation, which was Fredric Jameson, Brecht and Method. So in a way, this conference is a sort of spooky action at a distance in time. And okay, that's me. That's all for me. Thank you again. Thank you very much for coming. And I leave the floor to Daniele.
For sure, but just two words. Before all, thank you so much, Fredric Jameson. It's an immense honor for me, for everybody having you here. And yes, Fredric Jameson, for me, but for many of the present, is one of the thinkers, the philosopher, the theorician, with whom we learned to think about the world. And so thank you for your work and thank you for your thinking. Now, just really another word to thank all the scholars, the terrific scholars that choose to participate in our conference. And now, let's get started with you, with Jason.
Okay, good.
Maybe you can see also the audience.
Yes, that's good. I like to see the audience. So first of all, I must thank you all for this wonderfully varied set of talks, which take my work as a starting point. And later on, I'll have a few brief remarks on these splendid papers that you're going to hear today, but we'll save those. But I must also express my lifelong regret not to speak Italian fluently and thus not to be able to participate as fully as I'd like in your discussions. I read Dante in Italian with Eric Auerbach when I was 22. I spent several intense summers in Italy studying Italian painting, but I never acquired a spoken Italian I could use profitably. And I guess that means I never had the exposure to Italian politics that would have marked me the way French politics did. Let me then go a little more along these autobiographical lines. I won't describe the peculiar American social situations that made me receptive to Marxism, but I will say what I've said elsewhere, that the event which proved to me that Marxism, besides being a theoretically consistent and attractive system, was also a living and a practical one, and that event was January 1st, 1959, the Cuban Revolution, to which I've always remained loyal. I will also say that the other discovery that meant everything to me was that in the great kiosk of Harvard Square, on my arrival there in my first year of teaching, of the journal Monthly Review. Paul Sweezy's been mentioned or will be mentioned, and so I'll add that the great book, Monopoly Capital by Sweezy and Baran, also seemed to me the most persuasive and realistic account of the contradictions of capital perhaps of American capitalism, if you prefer, which remains, I think, valid today. It posits, you'll remember, the tendential difficulties in investing surplus capital and their consequences. Those are different consequences today than they once were during the Trente Glorieuses, perhaps. But I would argue that the new ones are no less pernicious, as I hope to show briefly this afternoon. But let's first posit a few basic principles. Our representative or parliamentary systems function on the basis of middle and lower class voters, middle and upper class voters, I'm sorry. The lower classes turn out for different kinds of parties, let's say, of the communist or fascist types. This is why when socialism is no longer a political option, as seems to be the case today, momentarily perhaps, the alternative, as we see in both our countries, is fascism. One would say it the other way around and suggest that during the Trente Glorieuses, when fascism was no longer an option, forms of socialism were able to flourish, social democracy, essentially. Anyway, that would be the first of my political observations, and I begin with them since too often my work has been challenged as unpolitical, or at least as lacking in any interest in politics. But I've often evoked something called cultural revolution, and I need to say a word about why that's important. If our allegedly advanced societies have become consumerist ones, that means not only that superstructural categories, such as that of the commodity and commodification, become vital, but also that we need to invent usable theoretical versions of those which do not rely on asceticism or Puritanism, but which offer political bridges to the catastrophic situations in so many non-Western countries. Cultural Revolution is not a restricted reference to Chinese events of the 60s and 70s, but rather a more problematic one involving the invention of new political uses of superstructures, which have to do with the transformation of subjectivity and the possibility of aesthetic appropriation of daily life. At any rate, that's a political discussion I've always been interested in pursuing, and it seems to me immediately relevant to the question of socialism and fascism. Now I want to shift topics somewhat and have a look at Hegel's scandalous remark, wars are the health of nations. It seems worth examining this remark in the light of Hegel's well-known ambition to be the new Machiavelli, the Machiavelli of modernity or post-revolutionary times. I want to think it meant something a little less banal than the emergence of national solidarity in wartime, and maybe more than a phenomenon we know more about than he did, namely the extraordinary efflorescence of scientific and technological discovery and invention during wartime, which ran, as we know, from penicillin to the atom bomb, from computers to galactic exploration. I suppose one of the things Hegel might have meant, he must have studied Malthus, was the radical decrease in population as that opened up new possibilities, for example, for British labor after World War II. On the other hand, the bloodletting of World War I, which destroyed whole generations, would not have been a very stimulating prospect. But I want to suggest that one of the basic things Hegel meant by this appalling remark had to do with the destruction of capital in wartime. Year zero, yes, if you like, but the destruction of value-producing capital is a rather different matter, which, as we saw after World War II, opens up all kinds of new possibilities and new kinds of possibilities of new production. I think of Giovanni Arrighi's masterful Long 20th Century as a textbook lesson in at least the capitalist mode of productivity, ever mobile and as greedy as a virus for new and larger fields of activity. So I like to think that Hegel meant not brand new areas of the fanciest boutiques in a ruined downtown, but the chance perhaps to build whole new collectivities, productive collectivities. But you can't build a new collectivity without first transforming the individual subjectivities that make it up. This was, I think, the paradoxical and perhaps self-defeating moral of Schiller's letters on aesthetic education, probably the first and still most consequent blueprint for the kind of cultural revolution I've been discussing. Schiller wrote like Kant as a sympathizer with the French Revolution, who nonetheless deplored the terror. And the letters attempted to reason their way through that conundrum, their conclusion being this: you cannot really make a revolution unless you first transform the subjectivities hitherto in thrall to the habits and limits of the old regime. But if you've done that, he reasoned, you don't need a revolution at all. You've already made one. Chicken or the egg? This is an instrumental problem, and to solve it, we need a new kind of utopian thinking, maybe not the old utopia, which imagined the perfect state, but an instrumental utopia in which you imagined new utopian ways to create that perfect state. So let's indulge this utopianism a little further. Our current stage of capitalism, perhaps you want to call it finance capitalism, post-productive capitalism, consumption capitalism, rather than the productive kind, or following Baran and Sweezy, investment capitalism rather than the classical kind. We may roughly date this changeover from the Reagan-Thatcher era, or better still, from a neoconservatism in which the stock market takes precedence over the factory, and shareholders' dividends are more important than productivity. Or perhaps you want to date it from the sudden rise of the billionaire in place of the old-fashioned millionaire, something I would like, besides these developments in the West, to link up with the privatization of state business in the East and the very birth of those oligarchs we now call billionaires in the West. But Baran and Sweezy were clearly wrong about one feature of this new system they so presciently prophesied: the absence of productive investments. It does not only result in the creation of rapidly obsolescent war machines. There remains within the country, within the individual countries, one great unexplored source of potential wealth, and that's called politics. The billionaires' new investments can now, with the proper legal precautions, be funneled directly into political investments, which can be the source of right-wing governments as well as of the saturation of the judiciary. In other words, a transformation of the electoral system such that you no longer have to win elections is a kind of grim caricature of Schiller's revolutionary paradox. So the utopian will wish at once to go to the source and bar the very emergence of billionaires, limiting the wealthy henceforth to a reasonable sum, such as $1 million, perhaps. But how to do this without violence and without the terror? This is then the task of utopian thinking, to undo this Gordian knot and to stimulate Hegel's health of nations without recourse to war or bloodshed or the revolutionary terror, if you prefer. So here's the proposal. When I worked in China in the 1980s, this revolutionary country had two kinds of currency. One, the renminbi, was, as its name suggests, the currency of everyday life and of wage work. The other, the yuan, was a foreigner's currency to be used only for investments by these not yet existent foreign billionaires. Let's imagine something similar for our current imaginary situation. The wealthy are to have their own currency, and perhaps indeed their own upper house in the legislature, one which expresses their interests without bribery or buying the desirable income. In the same way, their investments will be directed. Not that one wants the wealthy to lose their incomes, but they must be blocked from political interventions and from any serious diversion of productive developments. Otherwise, the country's daily business will be conducted in renminbi, and the lower house of parliament will be the legislature guided by tribunes of the people who alternate at regular intervals, while the powerless consuls in the other house are to be limited to warnings and anathemata and baseless prophetic interventions. This utopian model, of course, lacks many things and would have to be modified in the light of utopian problems of other kinds. For example, it doesn't include the question of groups and collectivities, the dynamics of identity, and also those of the parties, or of the party as such, as I may say, believing that in the long run, a new social system requires the defensive capacity of a vanguard party, as well as the political enthusiasm generated by group feeling or by what Ibn Khaldun called asabiya. Meanwhile, such an experimental or utopian image would also have to deal with what's becoming unavoidable, namely that having reached the moment of a properly capitalist world system, any new utopian system would have to find it in itself to imagine some newer form equal to the demands of a now world population. Just as population outgrew the solutions of the family and the clan, and after that of the empire or the city-state, or indeed the nation as such, so also now the new collective forms are to be imagined, new collective forms are to be imagined which can accommodate the political needs of a world population. But they cannot be thought up by an effort of the will. They must arise organically out of need and desire. But now I must turn briefly to another topic, my last in this brief overview, and must return to the matter of theory and of literary theory at that, with which so many of you have been involved. My current work, indeed my current interest, turn on a philosophical concept called the category, which one finds in Aristotle, to be sure, but far more richly developed in Kant. I have no time to go into this interesting and obscure question in any detail, but you will perhaps guess how the categories, as they underpin all kinds of discourses, posit the existence of levels and thereby find their kinship with the problems of allegory, in which I have also been lately interested. Are there categories which govern at one and the same time literary and formal problems, and also political and economic ones, in which a shift in levels transforms a representational problem in literature into a political dilemma in the world of collectivities? This is at least what interests me today, and perhaps you can sense how the problem of representation might bind them together as much as it separates or distinguishes them. Representation in literature, representation in political systems. Is it possible that this word could mark some categorical kinship between these two very different things, the dynamics of class struggle and the problem of what is or is not representable in the narratives of daily life and individual subjectivity? Well, I hope at least in the coming months to be able to work these things out in some more convincing way. And I can only thank you again for the many papers, these many papers which are bound to help me along this path or process. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Professor Jameson for being with us today, and to thank everyone here. It's very special for us at Iuno to have such an audience. It's a space dedicated to visual arts, and we find only appropriate that you all are here to discuss today and to celebrate Jameson's long career, which has had an enormous impact into visual arts as well as contemporary arts. There's more people coming, so we are very happy to host everyone here with us in a very, very crowded room and a very, very hot afternoon in Rome. And I'm very excited also to introduce the first respondent to today's afternoon talk, Tania Rispoli, who is PhD in philosophy in Rome and is now having a second PhD in Roman studies and feminist studies at Duke University, where you are teaching digital feminism and theories of social movements. You also just came back from Cannes, I heard, where you followed the last festival and you wrote on last films by Scorsese, Enos, Hosner, and Oliver Stone, specifically Lula. And you are talking today of Jameson and feminism, a possible dialogue. So I leave you the floor.
Thank you so much.
You.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for being here. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Of course, I'm now even more honored and humbled to speak after Fred, but moreover to contribute to the opening of these 2 days symposium on the thought of Fredric Jameson. I cannot thank enough the organizers, Giuseppe, Episcopo, and Daniele, Balicco, and of course Iuno, for conjuring and setting up this conference in honor of Jameson's 19th birthday. And for even thinking about including me in the program. I want to thank you also, Riccardo Bellofiore in advance, who will speak immediately after me. But most of all, I want to thank Fredric Jameson for always being present, attentive, curious, which is a very special feature for being 19 years old, and challenging during the years I was a graduate student at Duke University. His courses on postmodernism, French theory, and Brecht shaped my education, especially by suggesting a methodology for doing theory and literary criticism. So I believe, but we take that for granted, of course, that what Jameson taught us is to think about how ideology can be read critically and historically, starting from literary, cinematic, and philosophical objects. But it is precisely in the interaction between these ideological analyses and its social and political implications that I want to focus on today. So Jameson and feminism, a possible dialogue, attempts to argue that the dialogue between Jameson and feminism is indeed possible. We wondered, especially with Pietro Bianchi, who will present tomorrow on Jameson and Lacan, whether such a claim might not deserve a question mark. Jameson and feminism, is a dialogue between these 2 modes of doing theory and producing political practice even possible? My talk suggests that it is. So, to engage with Jameson's work, one must approach the subject matter, nearly 34 books in between the already published and almost published, with the curiosity of a sailor on the high seas. There are works such as Marco Gatto's book in Italian, Fredric Jameson, that trace the logic underlying his theory and literary criticism, while navigating an enormous number of references from architecture to modernist and postmodernist novels, from symphonic music to art, contemporary art, and theater. To navigate these high seas, I have chosen for today's talk a piece of circumstantial writing that in its brevity allow us to ask broader questions. Not only whether a dialogue between Jameson and feminism is possible, but also what is at stake in differentiating, at least in an aspirational way, a politics of singularity and a politics of totality. Jameson's 2015 article, The Aesthetics of Singularity, does indeed focus on the aesthetic as well as the politics of singularity. And we can take now the leap from one domain to another precisely because we read, and I quote, any ontology of the present must be both an ideological analysis and a phenomenological description, end of quote. There is, of course, a distinction between matter and form, content and genre, even within the specific genre of theory and the subfield of feminist theory, but also in our age, reciprocal relationship that allow us to grasp the zeitgeist of postmodern fragmentation. In the Aesthetics of Singularity, Jameson wonders, what are the superstructure and substructure in the 3rd stage of contemporary capitalism? We can call, he argues, the first one postmodernity and the second one globalization. As we know, reading the 1984 article on the New Left Review on Postmodernism, the most relevant feature of it, what extricates the post and modernism, is the preponderance of space over time, such as in the architecture of LA. When you are sitting in a class with Jameson, you are constantly looking at all these images of old LA's building. And there, the time crashes in the horizontal urban development in a way that history and future are reduced to the present or reduced to the body. In the realm of aesthetics and taste, we have contemporary art and even the molecular cooking, which showcases an art object as a collage, an installation made up of multiple components, a dish reduced to the minimum. In the realm of political and social theory, we see a tendency of reducing to the ontic, as in the case of North American feminism, which, as Jameson warns us, reduces every social and political claim to the body. The critique of essentialism and universalism ends in a circular process as a quasi-normative praise of singularity. The anti-foundational move of rejecting essence in favor of performance is reversed in the affirmation of a new ground to be found in identity politics. In Jameson's word, and I quote, "The affirmation by new collectives of their own uniqueness and singularity, which often seems to take form of a religious revival, thus undermines the very idea of singularity, which is thereby reduced to purely individual affair." The pitfall of identity politics is to condemn universalism while returning to an essentialist politics in which the essence becomes the singular, very specific and isolated identity itself. The challenge of postmodern social and political theory is the impossibility of mapping space beyond the multiplicity of modular forms of the shopping mall, as well as the messiness of the urban sprawl. Similarly, the challenge of feminist theory is the impossibility of tracing a map for totality, which we should understand not as a normative or substantive principle, but, as feminist theorist Cathy Weeks has written, as an interpretative horizon. A theory of totality does not substantively affirm a subject, such a party, a single issue, or a program, but a methodological alternative of interpreting the whole map instead of fragments. This map, however, and this is the main takeaway of Jameson's methodology, must be conceived as a diagram that does not suppress differences and conflicts. One of the struggles with comparing Jameson and feminism is figuring out which feminism we are referring to when we talk about feminism. Postmodern feminism, if we were to apply Jameson's category to current feminist theories, suffers from the same difficulty that we have encountered in American urban architecture when tracing a spatial grid that holds the sprawl together. But it does so, I think, in two divergent ways. The first way follows to the end the politics of fragmentation, and in so doing rejects the problem of totality. The second way appears in a kind of reactive form as a search for a totality that has been lost. The theory and practice of identity politics, as Mimo Cangiano writes about walkwords in the US academia and elsewhere in his book Guerre culturali e neoliberismo, expresses the desire for hyperfragmentation. Identity is a safe haven, and in its best version, the additive process of summing up multiple individualities. I'm thinking here, with feminist theorist Jasbir Puar, of Israel's pinkwashing and transwashing operations when the Israeli military, while waging a long-running and now particularly ferocious colonial war against Palestinian civilians, displays the LGBTQI+ and even the trans flags next to their tanks. Reframing the identity to the single instantiation of the body, coagulating the activity around a single issue, is a process that leads to a singularization of politics. In this sense, is the politics of singularity. But we find a second tendency in feminist theory, which is the return to undifferentiated forms of unity, where the intention to map the totality becomes a nostalgic instinct for renaturalization through monistic unification. Many of the theories of the posthuman, in the attempt to design a new ontological and ethical web between human and non-human entities, in the effort to give an account of new futures for ecological care, reveal evidence of an attempted process of totalization. But what do we mean by totality as an analytic grid? Or how do we find a common syntaxis, or even a syntaxis for the common, to quote other of my teachers, in all these losses and nostalgic recoveries of totality? The process of totalization attempted in post-human feminist theory conceives of totality as essentially homogeneous. The natural cultural continuum is presented as a poem, the quote is from Haraway, composed of multiple bodies and plural metaphors. But it is not only the post-human feminism that performs this operation, since feminist media theory and feminist Afro-pessimism also attempt to recover a form of lost totalization in the form of unification. In the first case, by emphasizing the human technical continuum. In the second, by emphasizing the ontology of blackness, and mentioning just that because maybe it's less known here, in which blackness operates through death, not only on individuals, but as a structural device that affects every aspect of society, politics, and economics. Exploring these feminist threads, which often refer to unifying and homogeneous forms of totality, albeit in the different realms of nature, technology, race, with the method of the critique of ideology, we can see how, in addition to an aesthetic and politics of singularity, there is also an attempted aesthetics and politics of totality. This totality, however, is the one of the undifferentiated. What is missing, and what is missing in the political implications of this theory, which point to either often regeneration, so we have to regenerate or we have to destitute, is precisely the idea of a difference or a set of differences that might be expressed in the form of a social and political conflict. The question now is whether there are also instances in contemporary feminism that point to conflictual interpretations of totality. Can we still make sense of an aspirational idea of class formation through gender and race? That's the question for many feminists today. I think that Marxist feminism, in some of its variants of the 70s and the revival that has taken place from 2016 to today in 2024, through feminist and transfeminist social movements around the world, especially Ni Una Menos, suggest this. And here I will quote mostly from the 70s Wages for Housework, but of course I have many contributions in mind that come from alternative threads of Black feminism and even transgender feminism. And we can read in the 1977 essay from Nicole Cox and Silvia Federici, Counter-Planning from the Kitchen, that in order to give a full account of labor productivity, we should include domestic work and care work, all those activities that humans need to socially and ecologically reproduce themselves. Cox and Federici write, this is well known, to demand wages for housework is by itself the refusal to accept our work as a biological destiny. Nothing, in fact, has been so powerful in institutionalizing our work, the family, and our dependence on men as the fact that not a wage, but love always paid for this work. For us, as well as for the waged worker, the wage is not the price of a productivity deal. In return for a wage, we will not work as before and more than before. We will work less. Today, of course, we could extend Cox and Federici's vision by evaluating the involvement of women and migrants in care work, which we understand, of course, as care labor, but also with affective and intellectual implications, as well as institutions that support all these extended reproduction, such as education, health services, food processing, and all that kind of stuff. And further, through transgender theory, we could even elevate the specific production of submerged economies, forms of economy that happen in the streets, in the club, in the bars, in the clinics, as trans theorist Ilma Latino seems to indicate when he tries to mix transgender theory and Marxism. However, what I want to highlight in Cox and Federici's quote is at least the attempt to examine in an aspirational way the totality of the processes that link production and social reproduction, the waged and unwaged dimension of labor, also describing what is the specific political subject. And of course, in the 70s, it was the housewife used as a big umbrella, right, to cover a multiplicity of productive figures. And what were the practices? Those are the main questions. For example, the demand for the wages for housework functioned, of course, as a provocation, a perspective, and a utopian demand in the sense that Fred was highlighting just a little bit before. The idea was that reclaiming wages for housework would simultaneously disrupt the labor system and the heteropatriarchal and racial family through which capitalism reproduces itself socially. Today, when social movements reclaim in a similar provocative and utopian way for basic income, or when it was the 2020 during Black Lives Matter for defunding the police, they also aim to map an interpretative horizon by formulating a demand and inventing a conflictual practice. Marxist feminism shows the possibility of creating an aspirational map of totality out of conflict. It does so by interpreting the process of value production in the social realm of care through the identification of subjects and practices of struggle. Today, I think all this heritage has been taken up by the feminist and transfeminist social movement Ni Una Menos, which maps the strict relationship between production and violence, highlighting the marginalization of gender and transgender people within counter-reactionary right-wing politics, shifting what was once the demand for the wages for housework into the more comprehensive practice of the strike. And we know that in this case, the strike is stripped from its traditional meaning as the working class practice of refusing to work in order to negotiate better working conditions in order to highlight a more general productivity. To answer the initial question that I posed in this talk, is a dialogue between Jameson and feminism possible? The answer is yes. In particular, the statics of singularities show that feminist theory and theory has become in the postmodern era. It also helps us to read the counter effect that has emerged in recent decades, which is often the search for an undifferentiated totality, as in posthumanism, feminist media theory, and feminist Afro-pessimism. These tendencies are analogous in some ways to the modernist tendencies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in which rationalism and rationalism were both opposed and mutually implicated in one another. In this case, the politics of singularity is often counteracted by a nostalgic praise of a politics of totality that yet is often free from any form of conflict. It seems to me, however, that in the multiplicity of feminisms, the recentering of the problem of value of the activity of work in the form of care work shows at least an attempt to describe a complete grid of the system while creating forms of conflict. In this way, we could use the interpretative filter offered by Jameson to explore not only contemporary articulations between structure and superstructure, as he was suggesting just a while ago, but also political practices that attempt to hold together the problem of mapping totality, as well as the new social, political, gender, and racialized forms of conflict that might emerge. Thank you again, everyone, and thank you, Fredric Jameson, and happy birthday.
I would suggest that we keep remarks for the very end, and we invite now Riccardo Bellofiore, who is who is retired from the University of Bergamo, and I've been instructed to mention it and stress it.
Exactly. You told me that.
I made the great resignation 3 years in advance.
I was so proudly the claim that I thought, like, I have to really, really say it loud and clear.
Yeah.
You studied with Claudio Napoleoni and Augusto Graziani, taught political economy at the University of Bergamo. You're mainly interested in Marxian theory of value and prices, on monetary theory, theoretical theory of the 19th century, philosophy of economy, and tendency of contemporary capitalism. Lastly, you published, curated with Stefano Breda, the Italian edition of the volume by Michael Hendrick, La scienza del valore, la crisi marxiana dell'economia politica tra rivoluzione scientifica e tradizione classica, 2023, and with Tommaso Ridolfi, you curated for edition editor, New Direction in Modern Economy, Marx Key Concepts. With Giovanni Scola, you manage the page. Economisti di classe, was so beautiful. Class economists, economists of class. So thank you. Very excited to have you here with us.
Thanks to you and all the organizers for having invited to this dialogue with Fredric Jameson on his interpretation of capital. In fact, I was studying law in early 70s, and in 73, 74, that is exactly 50 years ago, I went to a course of Claudio Napoleoni, and that changed my life. And that was the first time I read volume 1 of Capital. 20 years ago, it was end of 2004, beginning of 2005, some young people in Bergamo asked me to run a reading capital group, which lasted 10 years. I think that may be a reason why I'm here, because Daniele Balicco was there, Pietro Bianchi was there, and also many others, and I would like also to remember Michele Dallago. I named these three because since then they very much stress the influence of Fredric Jameson for them and urged me to read him. I had read something of him, but too little. 10 years ago, some students asked me, so when that other reading group ended, they asked me to do some public lectures in Turin on volume 1, and those who know Italians may venture on YouTube and they find that. I am honored because to my shame, actually, I didn't read Representing Capital before, and it was a kind of belated discovery. Discussing with Fred is a challenge and opportunity. The book, I must confess, is not easy. So I read it twice, in fact, 3 times, because of the excerpts. In the second time, the books revealed to be a very tight argument. There are, of course, differences, some may be important, of interpretation, but I think that a lot of my interpretation, rather than simply alternative, is complementary to Representing Capital. Before going to some quotes, just to give an idea of my reading of Capital Volume 1, especially though not only the first 7 chapters in English, first 5 chapters in Italian, I give a list of some theses of Jameson that I completely agree with. Capital, as has been already recalled by Tania, is a book about totality. It is a book about a system. So the references to Hegel comes immediately to mind. This more or less is quite diffused. So with it comes second argument I agree with is the stress on dialectical method. Even though maybe here there may be, I'm not sure, a slight difference, because I am in favor of the thesis by Helmut Reichelt that dialectics is in Marx the method of withdrawal, that is, it's only strictly valid in capitalism. Third argument that I like it very much, it is the anti-dogmatic attitude of Jameson. He never sweeps under the carpet Marx's problematic moments. Fourth argument that I very much agree with, and this is quite not diffused. Just simply go to Wikipedia, and you see that who is Marx? A philosopher. The same is also said of Rosa Luxemburg, who actually made a PhD on political science and, imagine, economics. The argument by Jameson is that capital is not a philosophical project, is not a literary allegory. This is important coming from Jameson. It is not a political book. On this we may discuss a little. It is true, but it's also not true. The recovering of the theory of alienation, though in a very intriguing way, it is very similar to my way of a backward reading of the theory of alienation. You begin from Capital and then reread the writings 1844. Another argument on which I very much agree, the fact that Jameson stressed that yes, there is an impersonal agency, at the same time there is a class agency. Do you stress the one? Do you stress the other? He says both are true. It is a unity of opposites or opposites. I'm not sure of the right English pronunciation. Seven argument on which I agree. He shares what he calls Hegel's delight in activity, though I would rather say labor, not activity, which to me is quite generic. So he actually, as I understand him, distances himself on the abolition of labor, the elimination of work altogether, and the like. I think I was at 7 argument.
Yeah.
The 8th argument is the stress that in Marx there is 2 figurative arguments. I will come later on the term figurative. A kind of commodity static objectness on one side, and the stress on the mathematical process turning substances into laws of motion. And he rightly says that these, for Marx, not for the Marxist, for Marx, were quite compatible, even though I must confess Fredric Jameson as a way of talking of mathematics, let me joke, as the devil, which is a bit sometimes, but not here. 8th argument that I agree even in disagreement. He wants to escape from chapters 1 and 3 of Capital, first part. But it does not say like Althusser or Korsch, does not read them. Actually, he reads them very carefully. In fact, the group, my reading Capital groups knows that because I took 1 year just reading the first 3 chapters to find the escape door. 9th argument, this should be developed more, but I have not the time. The great idea that, in fact, in Capital Volume 1, temporality is introduced in a process subject to the mirage of synchronicity. I should explain this, and it is not very precise, but the mirage of synchronicity has to do for me with a kind of two Hegelian reading of capital as circularity from capital to capital, and the introduction of temporality is related to the linear process going from labor to capital, but that should be explained. Now, one of the points of my understanding, not easy understanding of Fredric Jameson, was between the second and the third reading, when I went to read Erich Auerbach on figura, because this term is everywhere in representative capital. Maybe I missed it, but it is never defined. And it is key to the argument of Fredric Jameson. More or less, translated in my terms, the figural demonstration, translated through also Auerbach, the figural demonstration is create a nexus between two notions, both real in a sense. One does not only signify itself, but also the other. And the other, say coming later, but here the time is there and is not there, the other encompasses and fulfills the first. Now, what I discovered is that actually my interpretation of capital actually could be framed in this term. When I say capital, I mean capital volume 1. Let me go through some quotes. What is happening?
Forse l'ha fatto partire.
Yes.
Deve essere fatto partire questo.
Dovete cercare. Qua.
Sì, sì.
Vai.
No.
Okay. This is the cover. I don't know German, but I know now quite well the German of Marx Capital. That's how I exploited these poor guys for 10 years. I read all the translations, looking at the original, and discovered horrors. And the most horrific translations are the ones in English. Even when they are good, they are science fiction. I have not the time to explain it. So here, mostly I use a translation which is on online by Hans Erber, but I correct also his translation. And he does the only thing which has to be done with the classics: the original on the left and the translation on the right. Let me begin from the beginning, page 2 probably of Capital, where Marx says exchange value manifests itself at first as the quantitative relation between use values, things, so to speak, the bodies of things. These may, it is arbitrary. Then Marx says exchange value seems to be something accidental and purely relative. A valeur intrinsèque, something which is within the commodity, seems therefore a contradictio in adjecto. Here, the important thing is to understand the difference between erscheint and scheint. They are very different. Erscheint is a manifestation phenomenally. Let us say, I have to be quick, so the Hegelians permits me that, as things they are. Scheint borders the illusion. It seems that you look at the superficial level, remaining there, then it is illusory. If you connect it, let us say, to the essence, it is not there anymore. Now, from here comes, I have to go quick, that actually value, which Marx says is behind exchange value, what it is, it does not exist at this level of the argument. It is just a ghost, It is an ethereal presence. And how Marx shows this? With a wonderful quote from Shakespeare, Henry IV. The objectivity of value differs in this respect from them quickly, that one does not know where to have it. Let me excuse, Marx was not very politically correct. There is an innuendo here and in Shakespeare, but I don't want to go there. Unlike the crude, tangible objectualization of which use values are composed, this body of value does not contain a single atom of natural matter. We have not yet a value thing. To have a value thing, we should look at the value objectualization as expression from some social unity, Einheit. The English, the strange people, when they translate capital, somehow very often translate Einheit, unity, as substance, or even embodied, which is not exactly the same thing. It is something purely social, and at present, immaterial. This is what Marx says. But Marx is a materialist. He says that this ghost must take possession of a body. Where are we? In a ghost story? Yes, we are in a ghost story, because in fact, the value within the commodity, the valeur intrinsèque, actually succeed in taking possession of a body. The body of money as a commodity, gold. I have to go quick. Money does become what Marx calls an absolute value. Absolute comes from Latin, absolutus. It is the soul of the value of the commodity which is separated and take possession of the body of money as a commodity. Here, the important thing to understand in this quote is the difference, which usually the Marxists don't do, between fetish-like character and fetishismus. The point is that as the commodity social powers, yes, as the money social powers, yes, we may say as capital, even the means of production, social power, yes, the social powers are absolutely real. They are not of the labor, they are of capital. It is a fetish, and these are fetishes, and these fetishes have true powers, but only in the specific historical situation. What is fetishismus? Is when you naturalize this situation. And as is said in the last phrase, as soon as these proportions have attained a certain customary fixity, they seem to spring from the nature of the products. When the social power seems shining to spring from the nature of the products, then you have what? Fetishismus. Otherwise, what you have? Reification. You have what is said before, that relation of persons manifest themselves as social relation of things. Here, Marx says, you more or less see the social relation there. But at a certain point, the thing becomes so powerful that this origin of the reification is cancelled, and then reification turns into what may be called dinkification. Sake dinge in German, or something like that. I apologize for the pronunciation in German, which must be horrible.
At this point, you have money as absolute value. When you have money as absolute value, the last phrase is in the value relation, the money, absolute money, counts as embodied value. This embodiment is Verkörpern, the god which has taken possession of an empire. This I already explained before. It is the soul going from a commodity to the circulation. So you have money as an absolute, the absolute body, but money as an absolute gives way to capital as an absolute. An absolute and Marx defined as das übergreifende Subjekt, the overgrasping and dominating subjects. This is the pretense of capital of being a fetish positing its own presupposition in the circularity that I told before, from capital to capital. But how the fetish was originated? What was the constitution of the fetish? This is revealed in the second section of chapter 7 on the valorization process. Marx writes, by turning his money into commodities that serve as the material elements of a new product and as factors in the labor process, by incorporating living labor power with the dead substance, the capitalist at the same time converts value, past materialized and dead labor, into capital, into value big with value. It must mean pregnant with value, something like that, as if its body were by love possessed. For decades before doing the work, I said, oh, what a poetic idea. Then I discovered that it came from Goethe, Faust. And what is that? It is a rat which is poisoned and starts to move when he's dying as if its body were by love possessed. Living labor becoming dead labor. The important point is lebendige Arbeitskraft. That's why I do not agree totally with Fredric Jameson that says that Capital is not a book about labor and it is not political. The point is that labor in Marx means Arbeitskraft, labor power. Lebendige Arbeit, living labor, but there is also in key points lebendige Arbeitskraft, living labor power. Workers as human beings regarded as just the bearers of labor power. They are the workers. Now, the point is that labor power is one thing, living labor is another. They belong, as the quote says, to the capitalist. So they are distinct, but they are united in the worker. And it may exist a situation which must be constructed socially and politically and trade unions, etc., in which the capitalists can't do what they want with the workers. And this is a political issue. And Marx takes chapters and chapters, 1/3 of Capital, I think, in terms of pages, and showing how this is difficult. The capitalists buy not the worker, but the labor power, but then he has to put the worker in the process, in the capitalist process. The labor process, from his point of view, is a process between things. Also, workers are treated by technology as things. But at this point, the living labor must be extracted from workers. And how this happens? From his point of view, the point of view of the capitalist, the labor process is nothing more than the consumption of the commodity purchase of labor power. But in fact, Marx is saying that it is the consumption of workers themselves. There is a song that Riccardo Lago gave to me decades ago, all used up. This is the situation. I have no time because I think I have 5 minutes, 4 minutes, so I have to go quick. One of the great things of the book by Fredric Jameson is the part on cooperation manufacturing the machine. There we see that the individual worker, the isolated workman, is not anymore producing anything. Only the collective worker, Fredric Jameson says, produce the commodity. But in fact, the real German is not collective. It is immediately socialized labor. This is interesting because most contemporary Marxism says that where is the socialization of labor? It is in circulation. Are they wrong? No, they are absolutely right. But later on, Marx says, even though this is true, the capitalists have to having workers to cooperate and giving cooperation as a free gift, they have to purchase the labor power from them. Putting them together, this creates, of course, the possibility of political action, and capital has to put them together also technologically through the real subsumption of labor to capital. So workers are immediately socialized in production. This is very interesting because it gives hints of what socialism should be, a situation in which there is immediate socialization of labor, which does not have to find social validation as a commodity afterwards. A great point of Fredric Jameson, again, against most of the left today, is that he always stressed that capital has a negative side, but there's also a positive side. And he sees one thing that very few actually saw. I'm not saying this just because I am one of the very few in my first paper. In chapter 15, chapter 13 in Italian, Marx says, yes, there is this negative side. The poor worker is destroyed, but modern industry compels society to replace the detailed worker of today, who is reduced to a fragment of a human being, by the fully developed individual, which is a socialized individual, by the way, who is fit for a variety of labors, ready to face any change of production, and to whom the different social functions he performs that has so many modes of giving free scope to his own natural and acquired powers. Now, you must be very blind not to see, but Jameson sees that you have the multi-sided human being of the 1844 here, but not as a generic Gattungswesen, as something which is historically produced in a contradictory way. It may be completely wrong, but clearly this is the idea of Marx. Historization, and I close. Two points, if I can, very quick. The first, I said that I began with Claudio Napoleoni to read Marx. Yes, but at the same time I was doing political activity with workers at Fiat. They were all males. If I would have been in Biella, probably they would have been all females. But Fiat at this time, not at the late 70s, but in the early 70s were all males. But well, what I said to you about this three-dimension, labor power, living labor, and human being, comes from there. This is an interview done in 1969 in which a worker, yes, with some error of philology here and there, is almost quoting Marx. I want to explain the struggle. The boss with the wage thinks that he buys a worker, okay, labor power. Just like you buy a kilo of apples, you sell yourself and I pay you. Then I consume you however I want to. The fate of the commodity is that of letting itself be consumed. But the worker is a bit of a special commodity. It is a commodity that wants to have power to control every day how it is consumed. The end. Well, here it should begin the dialogue. I agree with a lot of the book of Jameson. I do not agree that the key point is unemployment of contemporary capitalism. It is labor, and unemployment is very often a form of labor, of casualized labor, etc. But I am a bit less optimist, but not completely pessimist than Jameson. To me, the problem for Marx and those attached to Marx, like unfortunately I am, is this one. Marx thought, and he was right, that capitalism was concentration with centralization. I have not the time to define the notions. Contemporary capitalism, since 30, 40 years, is divorcing centralization from concentration. Now we have centralization without concentration. Capital buys the workers, can connect them as productive, but they are not in relation, even if they are in the same space, tavolo, or in the same qualcosa del genere. So one should be desperate. Then one reads a true leftist newspaper, the Financial Times, in 2016, Sarah O'Connor, not the one of the Terminator, she did a wonderful article, When Your Boss is an Algorithm, and she shows that even these separated workers invented at Uber, Deliveroo, etc., I don't tell you why, the way to connect themselves in a struggle. And she writes, not me, she writes, algorithmic management meet algorithmic rebellion. Since I am more Luxembourgian than other things, I don't think that this you can write them down. They are not written in any book. They change every time. You have to construct with the organization from below, if you can, and the game is not over.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, these are wonderful papers. I'm just going to make a few brief remarks, sort of footnotes. What struck me in Tania's paper was the suggestion we must take today's problems in Marxist feminism as a continuation of the pay for housework debate, in the sense of Cox and Federici. This is an admirable and stimulating suggestion to which we should add the reminder of capitalism's solution to that now older debate. It took the form, this is how capitalism solved that stage of pay for housework. It took the form of washing machines and of fast food. In other words, capitalism itself stepped in to solve the pay for housework dilemma, albeit without pay and with continuing housework. Women still work double, and this should incite us to delve more deeply into the structure of marriage and also to restructure our conception of pay and finally of labor, and in particular, the labor of medical care and the labor of education as production, as such. that would also, I think, be the consequence of following Bellofiore's complex and detailed argument consequentially, and it should be ideally push us to the limit, namely to ask what, in that case, Marxism has structurally to offer some new socialism as an urgent replacement of capitalism today. I felt that my book, Representing Capital, had one crucial proposal in the analysis of the production of unemployment. I see that Bellofiore doesn't quite agree with me, and I don't know whether I'm happy with his modification of my formula, which consists in the substitution of the terms relative versus absolute. Relative, absolute production of unemployment, relative production of unemployment. But of course, for that, we would need to look at the unevenness of globalization and the world market. We're still thinking in terms of individual nation states. And that's, I think, that's the step that must be taken beyond, should we say, classical Marxism. What I feel I might best contribute at this stage to the discussion is to try to describe again what I was trying to do in this little book, whose title was meant to be a significant clue. Representing, yes, that was the heart of it. And I very much appreciate Bellofiore's rich discussion of figuration in this respect. He talks about Auerbach and so forth. This is all very interesting. But maybe I would, from a different angle, have a recourse to Althusser's notion of ideology, and that would give you another idea of what I was trying to do. You remember that, I think now, sometimes decried definition of ideology. It isn't everybody's definition, of course, but it's a very stimulating one. Ideology is the subject's representation of his or her imaginary relationship to their real conditions of existence. The Lacanian motifs are not to be neglected here, but it's easiest to see this along phenomenological lines as the individual's attempt to map a relationship to capitalism. It being understood that the map can never be accurate or true. Capitalism is this immense machine which we can never visualize as individuals, nor can we ever accurately visualize our own personal and individual relationship to it. This is why those attempts will always have to harness this or that ideology, or narrative, or figuration, or mythology, if you like, in order to produce some kind of useful personal fantasy about our place in the world and our relationship to life, that is, our position in the mode of production. But this is not only an autobiographical or literary problem, but also a social scientific one. Marx must also try to represent the intricate collective machinery of capitalism for the individual reader. And this is why it's appropriate to grasp capital itself as the construction of the volume, that is to say, the construction of a complex image or Vorstellung of that complex and superhuman trans-individual reality. Excuse me. It can never be apprehended directly in any unmediated way, although the moments of crisis, let alone revolution, come closest. At any rate, all such attempts must respect that fundamental gap, which can never be bridged, between individual experience, existential experience, if you like, and what must remain an absent mode of production, or an invisible one, or an ungraspable one, an unrepresentable one. This is why Bellofiore's discussions of abstract and concrete, latent and surface, and so on are so central. We could hold a whole seminar on these pages of his, reading them alternatively from a structural and figural perspective, structural or figural. Althusser is there to remind us that, however, such discussions draw on conceptions of appearance or shine, if they're Erscheinung and shine, the latter are also real and objective shine, appearance. I did think that the existential side of all this was powerfully expressed in those terrible eyewitness pages of Capital about starvation. Now I think I can't make any more useful comments about this richly detailed paper without opening endless avenues of exegesis, but I do want to salute Bellofiore's diligent examination of translated terms in a variety of languages. For this is, of course, the key not only to Marx's meaning, but also to his thought, and to that objective historical situation in which he can only dispose of a limited set of philosophical and technical terms, the terms of the period. Are we any better off today? At least the vocabulary field available to us is a different one from that of Marx. But I would certainly agree that, for example, and quite against the arguments of Althusser, the concept of alienation from the earliest period runs right through Capital in however disguised a fashion. And I also want to salute in both these papers the notion of the what I'll call the unassimilable. Tania spoke about a kind of utopian thought, which is not some candy-colored thing, but which is unassimilable, which is somehow disruptive. I think that's the kind of utopian thought that I'm interested in, a utopia which is disruptive of our current situation, our current thinking of that situation. Indeed, if you like Althusser's notion of ideology, of our ideology, of our attempt to fit into this situation. That's what a true utopian element should do. And as for Bellofiore, it seems to me that that's what he was evoking when he talked about the living labor power. And it's, how can I say, it's a re-dramatization of those old insights of 1844 that continue to exist underneath the argument of Capital Volume 1 as a veiled and hidden sort of presence, as that which is precisely unassimilable, immediately socialized labor as it is unassimilable, finally, to capital. These are the things which cannot be domesticated and which remain there. And if I didn't convey that, I hope I did in my book at least, that capacity of labor, then I do so now. Okay, so that's now I shift back to the position of a listener to your discussions from which I hope to learn much. Thank you.
È possibile. Just a very quick remark. Yes. Okay. Then we can talk.
Then we open
together. Just
Yes, I listened and I very much agree, and on some things I am intrigued, so I should think more. I see the influence of Althusser on you, but what I very much admired in the book is that, as with Marx, you, when you read an author, always say something which is strange for the followers of the authors. So rightly so, because that's also when I made my strategy. You put this relationship between Althusser and Korsch. They are different, but they are both right. There is an I think, an influence of Adorno, though it is not too on the surface and so on. I think that what you say about ideology is right. Simply, but yes, we are discussing very quickly. There are a lot of mediation from what I see as the Darstellung and then the ideological moment. What I would like to add to what I said is that whatever is the right translation of Darstellung, which here is not very relevant, is that I think that what's interesting in Marx's exposition is that the categories shift, and what is one thing at a certain point becomes another. It is an example of figuration. So what is an Erscheinung at the beginning of Capital becomes a shine at the end of Capital. There are some Italian Marxists, for example, who say, oh, he was not coherent. Sometimes both are the same way, and so on. When Marx arrives at the chapter of reproduction that also you stress, it is formulated in terms of totality and macroeconomics and class, you realize that what was the equality between workers and capitalists in the exchange on the labor market, and that was an Erscheinung. It was not false, then becomes a shine, and workers who were free becomes slaves of capital. So this I think it is important, and I think gives you it makes you right in a lot of your arguments going along. There is one thing, however, that I didn't say, but I say now because it may also be related to the issue of feminism, etc. You know, I am one of the oldest here, not like you, but not too far. So I was there in the late 60s and in the 70s, and I saw the beginning, or the new beginning, if you wish, of feminism in Italy, which at the time was more related, and I still have some nostalgia with that, with socialist feminism, etc. Now, there is a thing that you say that I find absolutely crucial. There is this criticism to your book, this critique to your book, which is not unfounded, which say, you say that, you know, yes, this is volume 1, but we can't read volume 1 without volume 2 and volume 3 and going back. That's true. I totally agree with you that, however, volume 1 has a privileged status, and to be quick, I say that the reason is when you say that the key for Marx was the centrality of production, but not productivism. That was crucial in the wrong way that the debate with the feminists and the Greens in Italy at least went in the late 70s, because Green and feminists were criticizing Marxists, and rightly so, both the Leninists and both the workerists, because production was almost everything. So they said, there is productivism here, and it has to be rejected. And they were right. What they didn't see, as most Marxists didn't see, was that the centrality of production is due to the centrality of labor within capitalist totality. But the workers that I met in the early 70s had the centrality of labor against the totalization of production, against productivism, wanted to save their body. It is clear from the quote I gave. So there were connections. In the mid-60s, in Turin and in Venice, there were the battles against the nuisability, the nocività, pollution. Not only pollution, the nocività, nuisability, something like that, against the body. You know, the key word was health is not on sale. That disappeared, but that was a possibility of connection which went lost in the debate of who is the first wagon of the train for revolution. So it was an occasion which was lost.
Yeah, thank you, Riccardo, for this great response. And of course, I agree, there are also elements of discontinuity in between the wages for housework and contemporary Marxist feminist movements. The whole point of my intervention is to show also this kind of revival, right? So of the narrative. But of course, there are interruptions, and the machinery and the technology play a big role, especially in constituting a sort of capitalist reorganization of the demands and the pushes from social movements. And that, again, was a theorization, right? That was put forward, especially in Italy in the 60s and the 70s, and even today. But what seems to me is that all the problems that are related to the balances that we have between the wage dimension of labor and the unwaged dimension of the family, and moreover, the problem of the relationship between family and capitalism, also in its involvement with racism or colonialism, are still there in a way. So what interests me in Marxist feminism is precisely the attempt, and then of course there are many attempts, right? But the attempt to give a systemic account of this problem. And then historically, of course, we have the idea that these systems might be plural. One might be the patriarchy, the other one might be the work itself. And then where the race, where do we see the system of race into display? And of course, I mean, the debate can go bigger and bigger. But what I wanted to highlight in my intervention is precisely the attempt to give a kind of picture or a critique that is at least systemic. So that was my main point. And I really like, of course, you found a better definition that what I had in my paper of disruptive utopian. And so what we should wonder also these days is how do we produce this disruption? What do we mean for disruption? What are the practices also? What is the politics of this disruption? Because of course, as you said in one of your writing, the utopia is even in the mall, right? It's even in the shopping mall. And so, it can be, again, in a kind of return to nature or to other forms of unity. And so how do we practice a disruptive utopian seems to me a question that we should still ask ourselves, and that I hope to discuss more in these 2 days. Thank you, Fred, for your comment.
Now perhaps it's really the time to open to the public. And I will invite Daniele, Balicco, and Giuseppe, Episcopo, who have already gave us this amazing opportunity to come here.
No. Okay, but now is the audience time. So there are questions, answers, little speech.
Okay, I'll just start. I wanted to add something. Oh, yes. I wanted to say something to Riccardo. You mentioned at the beginning when you were like summarizing Fred's argument for representing capital, a kind of recovery of theories of alienations, and I wanted to ask you if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that. I think that there is a point, and this is my question. I have a small comment though. I think that when Jameson is like referring to the questions of like utopian potentiality, for example, in your talk, utopian potentiality.
Utopian potentiality.
Something where I would find it is precisely in the quote that you used from like the Fiat workers when it says there is something that it's not treatable like an apple of like a leaving labor powers. This like structural incompatibility between leaving labor power and the normal commodity. It's a utopian potentiality that can never be like taken away.
Yes, maybe one. Yes. Yes. Maybe one.
Magari quando parlate presentate.
Yes, maybe.
Here. My name is Florian Musknug and I'm Professor of Comparative Literature at University College London. Really excited to be here. Thank you very much for the brilliant and inspiring conversation. I had a question for Tania, Rispoli, for the second part of your talk and the way you talk about totality and the difficulty of achieving disruptive utopianism in these systems which you described as totalizing. And I guess I'm not really quite in agreement with the way that you describe this, and I'd like you to explain it a bit better, because particularly when you think of post-human feminism, of course, you know, if you think of, for example, the way that Braidotti uses the idea of assemblage, agencement, right? There is a sort of idea that these relations are, or these relationships between the component parts are not stable, they're not fixed, but I don't really understand why this leads you to think that if I understand you correctly, that these interdependencies are immaterial or not politically productive. So I would say that certainly in post-human feminism, probably in Afro-pessimism too, although that's a bit more complicated, I would say that the understanding of discursive devices is always distributed across economic infrastructures, and therefore always also materially embodied and also historically situated. And in fact, Haraway talks about situatedness. Yeah. So I'd just like you to elaborate on that a little bit, please.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
Okay. Other questions?
Wonderful.
Yes, maybe you can start.
Ready.
Okay.
Thank you. That's a great question, and also, yeah, very well phrased. So of course, I didn't want to oversimplify their thought, and of course, in both Haraway and Braidotti, there is still a theory of difference, right? Even though this difference is seen as a kind of multiplicity, and as you say, as a multiplicity of assemblages. And these assemblages are always material and immaterial. That's what I meant to say. But they are material in the sense that they are related to bodies, right? Or to the assemblages of bodies. And I read these authors with a great interest, especially Haraway, I have to say, in the transition, for example, in the conception of the cyborg as a body, right, which is always plural, to the idea of also companion species and all the assemblages that are in between the human and the non-human nature. But I see two problems here. And again, in my writing, I'm kind of more accepting of this theory rather than this short talk. One of the problems is that is really the conflict or even the crisis and the political crisis a trouble? So what is the distinction between a conflict and a trouble? I think that, I mean, words matter in a way. And again, the way they are proposing a utopian alternative is a way that goes through practices that are mostly of remaking, of reusing, of regenerating, starting from existing elements, right? Rather than that breaking down the field or the domain, or in a way. And we can see this explicit rejection also of in a way, old Marxism by Braidotti, where she says, okay, we should go further, okay? My proposal, my specific proposal, also in the vein of post-human theory, is that in reality, once that we acknowledge that we have an ontology that is multiple and made by many, many elements, on a political level, it's strategical to accept a small, tiny bit of binarism in a way. Otherwise, where is class? Otherwise, where is conflict? Otherwise, how can we formulate a demand? So it's a kind of moving around all these sources. And yeah, thank you for your question, because it was so great, and I didn't want to oversimplify all these theories that, again, I recognize that they make the difference, the topic of the difference kind of exploding, no, right? Instead of unifying. But again, what is the model there? Is the society or the nature? Are we going back to nature in right? In trying to overcome the division between nature and culture? Thank you.
Okay, I answer to Peter. If I understood your question, is what more on how I see, from my point of view, the recovery of the theory of alienation. Because again, in his way, Fredric says, "Oh, it seems that it is not, but in fact, it is the theory of alienation of the 1844." But then he finds a way to put Althusser within the 1844. Now, everybody has his own story. So I began with Claudio Napoleoni in 73, 74. At the time, he was very much connected to Lucio Colletti. Lucio Colletti, from my point of view, he had many limits, but since 67 and 72, he was one of the greatest Marxian interpreters, almost on this, together with Napoleon, almost on the same foot than Isaac Illich Rubin. There is also the legend, which may not be a legend, that actually he plagiarized Rubin because his first wife was Russian. And so he may have had access. They are not similar, but for sure, this stress on the theory of fetishism, he is one of the authors who use fetishism always, but never mistake what is what. So, you know, one key point of Colletti was the continuity thesis. For sure, Fredric Jameson has read the introduction of Colletti to the early writings of Marx in the Penguin. By the way, it does not exist in Italian. It probably is one of the last Marxist writings of Colletti. Now, if you go philologically, this continuity versus continuity, the discontinuity thesis is right. There is a problem in the discontinuity thesis. Almost all who went that way ended up pushing forward the moment of discontinuity until the letters of Vera Zasulich, before he was not the true Marx, or Koei Saito, even the first book of Capital was not the true Marx. I think, however, that the continuity may be recovered going backwards, that is, seeing how the same problems reappears in a different theoretical configuration, which means redefining the notions. That's what I tried to do in my paper of 1979, and the argument very quickly was, in 1844, Marx had an idea of labor as the, let us say, transhistorical, meta-historical essence of the human being. Why? Collective. Because the human being is natural, part of nature, and generic. He is the genus of all the genuses, I don't know how to say, which is the origin of this idea of the multi-sided human being. But that is a Gattungswesen. It is related to Feuerbach in a way that Marx rejected since 1845 onwards. Then you go to the Grundrisse, 1857. Another of my great authors is Alfred Schmidt. The notion of nature in Marx, there is an appendix very much in relation to the French debate of the mid-60s, and he says something which I think is right. Marx in the Grundrisse split the history. There are the natural modes of production before, looked from now, and from now you see the openings of the future, not the necessity of the future. In the Grundrisse, Marx says, this has some resonances with Lukács, the idea of Lukács that society is a notion only of the bourgeois era. He said, you know, before the human being was attached to nature, now it is not anymore so, and in fact, the human being, it comes to have the possibility, the contradictory possibility of this multifariousness, which was not there before. Then comes the chapter, in my article, the chapters 13 in Italian, 15, you know, that can be criticized in a very savage way, because Marx gives all the argument to say to that Marx, but is not it is a completely dream which turns into a nightmare. The utopian has to do for me in the book by Fredric Jameson on this, when he talks of the educational factory. In the same quotes that I do, no? The multi-file, it's an utopia. At the same time, you are right, but it would not be so strong as you did. There is not a structural incompatibility between living labor power as such. Because when you say this, I see my old friend, too many sense that I don't want to go into, Roberto Finelli, who says, oh, you are wrong, you are like Negri, you think that there is this insurgency that's not there. You know, the fact that there is a potential distinction and detachment of the workers as collective social from capital, it is not a given. It is always a result. And not to have that, since this is a problem in each capitalist circuit, capital builds what? Ideology. What is said? The school, this and that. The organization of labor, the machines. So again, you may have the two Marx, no, like the angel and the devil. The one who is utopian and the other who says, but you are completely crazy. This is related from one of the great points, in my view, of the books by Fredric Jameson, because there are some points in the book in which you are lost. Maybe you don't understand well. Then he has these lightnings, you know, and you are captured. When it's a quote and I terminate. He says, capital is an infernal machine, a machine constantly breaking down. Most of the left movements today are all reactions against the immense power of capitalism, their creative destruction. I don't want to enter into a fight with Tania, but I fear that most feminism is here. To that degree, they are all conservative in one way or another, aiming, that's not feminist, to preserve the few enclaves remaining from a simple era, or to recover something of the human scale of previous eras and their collective or communal forms. Marx alone sought to combine a politics of revolt with the poetry of the future and applied himself to demonstrate that socialism was more modern, not anti-modern, was more modern than capitalism and more productive. To recover, this is related in my view also to the current debate, which is very much stressing domination. And Jameson, rightly in my view, says dominate, in my translation, I may be wrong. Domination is fundamentally organized by the relation of production, so it's very key, centered on exploitation. It is the mode of reproduction of this structure. And here again, the attack on the left. The outcome of an emphasis on exploitation is a socialist program, while that of an emphasis on domination is a democratic one. Think that when he speaks of a socialist program, emphasis on exploitation, it's not just exploitation, it is exploitation with domination. Now, think of the debate today, even the ecological debate. When you go to the stress on domination, who is the subject? The human being. So we have gone beyond Gattungswesen to end into the human being and as such. Thanks, no.
Fredric, do you want to add anything?
There would be lots of things to add. I don't know where to begin. When Riccardo was talking about the movement from Erscheinung to Schein, well, that means time is inside the concept. The concept includes history. The concept is evolving in history. And so you can't pick out this one static concept and call it true. You have to see what's happening inside of the concept and what it's developing into. That's one thing I would like to insist on. Coletti was very great at certain moments. I agree with that. There's a very nice moment at the very end, I think, of Adorno's negative dialectics when he says something like this, and of course I don't have it, and I don't. He says, "Look, our perspectives are divided between that of the subject and the object." So it's sort of Brechtian. He says, whenever we are too blindly possessed by the needs of subjectivity, we have to switch to the objective. Whenever the object and objectivity has too great control over us, we must switch to a subjective perspective. And I think that's a very good, and as I say, almost Brechtian notion of of how to defamiliarize our own thinking. Finally, I just want to tell, it's a kind of joke here. Well, no, two things. On disruption, you know, maybe people don't know much about the American left in the 60s and so on. We had SDS and we had the famous Port Huron Statement, which was the manifesto of the SDS, of the American left under Vietnam and so forth. And they had a great idea, and I don't think they got it from Marcuse, but who knows? Anyway, they said, look, you complain about consumerism and so forth. We have to push that. The whole point is that to encourage the values of consumerism and so on and so forth, in order to show that the system cannot fulfill those things. It cannot deliver on those promises. This is the way you show how the system breaks down. Now, were they right about this? We have a profoundly consumerist society, so it doesn't need any. It doesn't need any encouragement. Does it show that the system is incapable? It should. I mean, and maybe that's our task. So finally, I end with this joke. This business of production, yes, the word productive and so on. It's very annoying. Productivism, we don't want that. Productive labor, well, I would think we do. On the other hand, then people will say, well, that's a workerism, and you intellectuals, your whole point is that you're non-productive. What kind of value do you produce? You don't produce any value. Well, there's a point in Capital. I couldn't locate it now, but it's in there, where I think it's in a footnote. Marx says this business of production. Who wants to be a productive laborer? I don't want to produce things. Let the bourgeoisie arrange that. I want to think about things and so on and so forth. So it's a very nice joke on the misuse of the nature of the word production. And it's the final thing I wanted to say has to do with we haven't mentioned the word humanism, but this is what Althusser was against. This is why the 1844 manuscripts were anathema to him, because of this notion that that's humanistic. I think we have to, humanism as a value certainly belongs to the bourgeoisie. I don't think we need to reclaim that, but we need to, and maybe nowadays under neocolonialism and its form of fascism, maybe we're not humanistic anymore, and so maybe humanism will become itself disruptive. But at any rate, I think we have to analyze a lot of these struggles, a lot of these theoretical debates on the left in terms of this absolute reaction against humanism. I have nothing against that, but we have to be aware of it. Okay, well, those are just some scattered thoughts, and with that, I there are more of them, but I think that's enough.
It's time for say goodbye. It's time for thanks again Cecilia Canziani for hosting us, for thanking Tania, Rispoli, Riccardo, Bellofiore for being here, and Fredric Jameson, who said he had to say a few words to start, but it actually was a talk that, well, if he knew that, we would have added to the program. Well, meta-modern irony of praxis over theory. It worked well. It worked even better than we thought when we planned to have this discussion online. And so, huge.
Thank you for all, really. And
thank you.
Bye. So thank you very much, everyone. We are recording for connecting online tomorrow.
Yes.
See you
See
tomorrow.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Riccardo, se vuoi salutare.
Thank you.
Thank you. Domani la fate in inglese.
Domani parliamo però.
E lui come fa? Capisce un po'?
Come spero.
Hai visto chi c'era?
No, chi c'era?
Diabolica.
Faccio a spegnere perché c'è la registrazione, mi raccomando, perché il primo paper, io so come farli, quelli butta sti paper qua, Quindi se non lo registri, questo paper qui non lo sentirà mai nessuno.
Ma no, ma lui sta registrando.
Fai tu. Fai che
Sta
sia-
registrando, però quando chiudi devi dirgli dove la metti la registrazione.
Tanto è sul mio computer, è già fatto.
Ok, perfetto.
Sì, no,
Io
io ho
posso-
fatto il locale, non online,
Ottimo. No,
perché il suo computer con la mia...
perché lui li butta i suoi paper, C'è una roba
fatto fare.
Mi sembra che ci abbia molto piaciuti anche lui. Diceva tutto effettivamente è completamente esperto, e invece